Our subject today is fictional autobiography, with emphasis on women writers in contemporary Spain. Indeed, the title of this presentation pays tribute to a novel by Lara Freixas, born 1958, El Amor o lo que sea. We'll have reason to refer to Freixas a number of times, not only because of this metafictional novel with autobiographical underpinnings and her later autobiography about her teenage years in her native city, Adolescencia en Barcelona hacia 1970, but also because of her insightful books on women authors and readers in Spain. Nevertheless, I will begin with an anecdote told me by a male Cuban French author, Eduardo Manet, or Manet, if you prefer, born in Cuba, 1930. My trip to Miami this winter was initially prompted by a conference on Cuban exile theater, and Manet, who has lived in Paris for many years, is one of the authors we discussed last week at the University of Miami. Unfortunately, he was not able to attend. Writing fiction based on one's own life can be a double-edged sword. The author has a deep knowledge of the subject that might render better results than choosing to write a novel about some exotic place or experience about which she or he knows nothing. On the other hand, a narrative based on the author's life can generate a range of reactions, not all of them encouraging. Manet was told by a judge for France's prestigious Prix Goncourt that he did not win that prize for his 1982 novel La Mauresque, The Moorish Woman, because the panel considered it autobiography, not fiction. Never mind that the action begins in the moments preceding the narrator's birth during an earthquake, and that the Niño, who is known only by that name, humorously provides not only a detailed description of the earth tremors, but also conversations between his mother in labor and the understandably agitated servants. Critics Louis Renza and Barrett Mandel have both asserted that autobiography can readily be distinguished from fiction. Renza says this is so even though autobiography may self-consciously borrow methods from imaginative fiction. Mandel states, in a somewhat outdated way, that readers of an autobiography see the life of the person sitting behind the typewriter who conveys the sense, "This happened to me." The Goncourt judges either had not read such essays or thought that the about-to-be-born baby was exceptionally precocious. You were supposed to laugh at that, by the way. Do I have to signal someone to see that we get laughter at the appropriate moments, or hold up a laugh card? Of course, the line between non-fictional and fictional autobiography can be narrow. Dealing with childhood as the subject of autobiography, Richard Coe observes that the use of dialogue reveals significant fictionalization. One might add that many writings about history, not just autobiography, may be less than objective. In his 1973 book on metahistory, Hayden White persuasively points out that history written in narrative style, in essence, is a literary artifact. We might think of historical narrative as a midpoint between objective facts and a historical novel that introduces a plot revolving around fictional characters imposed on a more or less factual historical background. That's, of course, what Pérez Galdós did in the Episodios Nacionales. Coe suggests that in autobiographical fiction, the character is determined by the plot and is required to act. In autobiography, instead of plot, there may simply be a pattern that affects exclusively the narrator subject, not the characters who surround him. In that opening scene of Manet's La Mauresque, is the Niño an agent during the earthquake and birth? The other characters are the ones required to act, but I see none of them as part of a mere pattern. Looking at the truth-fiction dichotomy from another perspective, I wonder if we were to write our autobiographies, would we lean to fiction? Wouldn't we carefully select anecdotes that make us look better than we are? Or suppress episodes we'd rather forget whenever possible and blame them on someone else if we can't? Given my recent forays into oral history for my local historical society in Wisconsin, I know now that most people have lapses in their memories, whether intentional or not, or that they prefer their version of the past over yours even when you have ample documentation to prove them wrong. With such thoughts in mind, I conclude that autobiography that pretends to tell the true story of one's life and fictional autobiography that doesn't may simply be different locations on the same spectrum. Although in 2007 at Rutgers I taught a graduate seminar on Spanish women writers, focusing on a range of autobiographical works, including memoirs and diaries, fictional or otherwise, I did not suggest to my students that they develop a spectrum or diagram of possible variations. I invite you to consider that for your own future research. Birute Siplihauskaite affirms that the feminine autobiographical novel today follows two principal directions: the configuration of the social I and the process of consciousness raising. I am not referring to that kind of differentiation of thematic approach, but rather to a fiction-reality dichotomy. A first stage along the spectrum I propose might be a factual, nonfiction piece that is limited to names, dates, and a relatively objective recounting of what happened. Como un libro cerrado, like a closed book, the memoirs of Paloma Diaz-Mas, born in 1954, could be placed at or near this starting point. Philippe Lejeune, in his analysis of the autobiographical pact, provides this definition. The writer assures the reader that the protagonist, who bears the writer's own name, is indeed the same person as the author. This is precisely what Diaz-Mas does. I found Como un libro cerrado, enhanced with snapshots taken by her father, to be a charming book about Diaz-Mas's early life. It revealed much to me about an author I greatly admire, and who came later to write how she came to write certain stories and novels, particularly those with medieval and painterly subjects. My graduate students found it less interesting than I, probably because the book is a relatively factual autobiography by a writer with whom they had limited familiarity. I think they would have preferred more action, plot, and dialogue. Diaz-Mas clarifies that these memoirs were inspired by a return to Madrid and the family home after years of teaching at a university in Victoria in the Basque Country. As she says in the opening lines of Como un libro cerrado, when we return, we always remember. Places have that power of evocation. She does not recreate or invent dialogues from the past. The family photo album and her notebooks from school help her to recall people and places. Even so, critic Luis Satoras, in reviewing this factual book for the newspaper El País, calls it a poetic novel. Obviously, he was not part of that panel that let the Prix Goncourt slip through Manet's grasp. At a midpoint along our proposed spectrum, we might locate works that introduce extensive dialogue and hence move in the direction of fiction. Such intermediate narratives might also not be limited in their focus on the writer alone, but rather develop as well the stories of family and friends. Such works might be labeled semi-autobiographical. A possibility here could be Cosas que ya no existen, Things That No Longer Exist, by Cristina Fernández Cubas, born 1945, a writer noted for her short stories, many, but not all of which, are in the fantastic mode. The 2001 anthology includes several chapters that deal directly with the author's life, and others that tell us of people she has met on her travels to various parts of the world. If some of the latter stories were not included in this particular volume, the reader might readily consider them fiction. If we read Freixas' novel El Amor o Lo Que Sea in tandem with her related autobiography, it could also go somewhere in the middle of the proposed spectrum, because we can easily learn just how closely the fictional character's experiences mirror those of the author. Pilar Martínez Quiroga has already made this kind of comparative analysis in the study listed on your handout. For example, both Lara and her narrator character, named Blanca, as young women, are employed as evaluators of manuscripts, the author for a famous literary agent and the character for a publishing house, and both are ardent readers of diaries. Several of the diaries that Freixas read with interest shortly after her graduation from the university are subsequently used as intertexts in her novel. Thus, the term semi-autobiographical could well apply to El Amor o lo que sea. I might also place in the middle of our diagram, but along a parallel to the main spectrum, works that can be understood to reveal repression or projection of some painful episode in the author's life. Two possibilities for that parallel kind of autobiography, to which we will return later, are Carmen Martín Gaite's Lo raro es vivir and Fernández Cubas's Mi hermana Elba. In our hypothetical diagram, at the opposite end from bio notes and more or less truthful memoirs, we could locate a fictional work that changes names and melds the author's veiled experience with those of others, but still lets the reader, with careful analysis, discover something about the author's life. We might thus categorize Tristura and Escribo tu nombre, two novels by Elena Quiroga. Quiroga's dates are 1921 to 1995. With the subtitle of her groundbreaking critical work, Birute Siplihauskaite, alerts us that Quiroga is not alone in writing in the first person. To prepare her typology of first-person narratives published between 1970 and 1985, Siplihauskaite read hundreds of novels by women writers from Spain, France, Germany, England, Italy, and Portugal. She relates Quiroga's two novels with the character Tadea to a wide current in women's writing. It is surprising how many novels denounce education, and above all, the environment in religious schools, a childhood experience that is a first step towards disillusionment, the discovery of corruption, and the loss of faith and trust. I hope I haven't offended anyone here by quoting her. If we return to our proposed spectrum, we should note that the last stage on it might be visualized as a bifurcation, like a subway or train line that leads to two different final stops. One path leads to a work whose protagonist bears a fictional name. The alternate path might be a novel that includes a fairly reliable autobiographical strand, using the author's own name for a narrator character, but juxtaposes that strand with other stories or subgenres. An excellent example is El Cuarto de Atrás by Martín Gaite, 1925 to 2000. Awarded Spain's National Literature Prize, El Cuarto de Atrás is a fascinating blend of memoirs and the novela rosa, that is, romance novel, two genres associated with women writers or readers. But it is also a self-begetting novel, written in the fantastic mode. Does self-begetting novel mean anything to you? Did I hear a volunteer to give me a definition? No, okay. I'll beget one myself. I attribute the term self-begetting, which describes a variation of metafiction, to a 1980 book by Stephen Kellman. The fantastic mode, as reflected in Martín Gaite's novel, is inspired by Todorov. Specifically, the Martín Gaite work can be classified as fantastic because neither narrator nor reader can provide a rational interpretation for what is happening. In Todorov's terms, both vacillate between absolute faith and total disbelief as to the reality of bizarre events, events that cannot readily be labeled as either natural or supernatural. In the opening pages of El Cuarto de Atrás, the narrator knocks a book on the floor, Todorov's Introduction to Fantastic Literature. That reminds her of a promise to herself to write a fantastic novel. At the conclusion of El Cuarto de Atrás, Following a night of strange adventures, the narrator discovers next to her bed not Todorov's book, but a stack of manuscript pages that begin with the opening words of the novel we have just read. A mysterious male visitor dressed in black has apparently served as her muse, helping her to give birth to the work, hence self-begetting. It is tempting to suggest that the enormous critical and reader success of El Cuarto de Atrás may be attributed precisely to its blend of genres or subgenres. To my knowledge, no one has rejected the book for being autobiographical. As Freixas and many other feminist scholars have noted, writing fiction based on one's own life has been particularly problematic for women whose works have been judged negatively precisely for being autobiographical. Freixas, who does not hesitate to punch holes in critical commentaries, daringly published her autobiography only 2 years after her novel Amor o lo que sea. Readers of this pair of 21st century works do not have to guess about relationships between character and author. Martinez Quiroga points out that Freixas also reports a negative response to women's writing for being disorganized or fragmented. Both Martín Gaite and Freixas take this criticism head-on in the structure of novels we are considering here. I should add that Freixas' novel, like Martín Gaite's El Cuarto de Atrás, may escape negative labels about women's autobiography by adroitly blending subgenres and modes. Sipley-House Gaite points out that Martín Gaite abolishes the constraints of time by pushing her work to the limits of the fantastic. Using a different strategy, Freixas moves beyond chronological memoirs to have her character experience a cinematic flash-forward of 20 years. Were I to write my memoirs, I would highlight a 1987 article of mine that discusses the emergence of Spanish women novelists following Franco's death. Despite the direction indicated by the wordy title, Women Novelists in Democratic Spain, Freedom to Express the Female Perspective, I believe readers specifically noticed these generalizations. In the first half of the 1980s, the characteristic shared by much of the women's narrative is a fascination with the metafictional mode. Perhaps the one aspect that these works have in common, however, is their tendency toward subversion. I omitted the connection between subversion and the fantastic because I didn't have a fantastic novel to include the way I did the stories that I dealt with later. I did identify a link between metafiction and subversion. Let me ask if anyone wants to define metafiction.
Self-referential.
Okay, that's one possibility. Well, that's good. That's punto de partida. In many respects, metafiction is a subversive literary mode. By calling attention to the artifice of its own construction, the meta-novel suggests to the reader that the external world, too, is a construct. Metafiction calls into question the view of reality found in the traditional realistic novel and underscores the fictional aspect of autobiography and history. A quarter of a century later, as I prepared this presentation, I was pleased to discover that in 1987, I had already thought about the connection between metafiction and autobiography. And I was equally happy to find that I'd made this observation. Notice I'm quoting myself. That's self-referential too, right? A meta-speech. Although the metafictional mode is a dominant trend for both male and female writers in the contemporary period, its use by women writers often reveals a self-conscious feminist strategy. Writing has been considered a male art. The pen is a phallic symbol, and therefore women are not equipped for the procreative act. The repeated presence of the woman writer within the fiction is thus an implicit vindication of female creativity. Building on studies by Freixas and Joanna Russ, Martinez Quiroga points out that a male-dominated literary world of critics and publishers has developed strategies to ignore and condemn the artistic work of women, including a tendency to deny connections between women writers by treating each one who succeeds as an anomaly. Martinez Quiroga observes that Martín Gaite in Desde la Ventana recognizes other women writers not only in the mid-20th century, but also in the case of Rosalía de Castro in the 19th. In Amor o lo que sea, Freixas debunks the myth that there is no community of women authors over the years by placing the diaries of such writers as Sylvia Plath and Colette within her novel. But she, like many Spanish women novelists in democratic Spain, also creates a writer character as a protagonist. Let me digress for a moment to observe that I had to reread my own article to find out what I said. It is true not only as we get older, but for all ages, that most of us find that our memories are not reliable. Anybody here's memories are 100% reliable? Stand up now. Maybe not anybody. That being the case, memoirs and autobiographies are not reliable in any absolute sense. Diaries, written as the events occur, may be closer to fact than fiction, but even in that kind of writing, why would the author not embellish or omit or invent as the spirit moved her? In the late 1960s and early 1970s, feminists in the United States started seeking diaries and letters written by their mothers and grandmothers in order to reconstruct women's history. As I tried a few years ago to piece together the story of my mother's family, I found that letters and postcards, while often posing tacit questions with no answers, were usually more accurate in pinpointing time, place, and names than memoirs written decades later. But I conjecture that some of the brothers who wrote postcards to my mother were unreliable narrators. Let us return to the subject of autobiographical fiction. Do you know what a Bildungsroman is? Good. Quick definition? A? I couldn't hear that very well, but it sounded right. It's a coming-of-age novel, right? And it's within the category of fictional autobiography. It was considered universal. I mean, this is for centuries. The Bildungsroman may not have been labeled that a long time ago, but the kind of novel's been around for centuries. It was considered universal if the main character was male and trivial if the main character was female. In preparing this talk, I Googled the terms female Bildungsroman and male Bildungsroman. The former elicits a number of relatively recent literary studies, one of which, from 1983, The Voyage In, Fictions of Female Development, is identified in a Wikipedia article as being perhaps the first literary criticism on female Bildungsroman. The title phrase, The Voyage In, suggests that young women embark upon discovering self rather than exploring the world. Sipleyhouse Kaite states that this study identifies the Bildungsroman as being the most frequent approach taken by contemporary women novelists. Care to guess how many entries I found for male Bildungsroman? None. I think the assumption is that a Bildungsroman would have a male protagonist, so you only have to pick out the exception to the norm. Before we get depressed over this finding, let's remember that after the Civil War, several women novelists, starting with Carmen Laforet and her Nadal Prize-winning novel Nada, rose to the forefront, almost always with narratives that were written from the perspective of a young girl. To be sure, these young girls, referred to by Martín Gaite as La Chica Rara, didn't fulfill the desires of the sección femenina in Spain, future ideal mothers and wives, in the reverse order, wives and mothers, because they were more interested in education than in clothes, more interested in intellectual pursuits than chasing a husband. I mean, that does make you a misfit if you don't fit in with the dominant mode. And their writings were Bildungsroman, certainly. In novels of the 1950s, by such Spanish women writers as Laforet, Martín Gaite, and Elena Quiroga, do we find main characters that are closely related to the authors themselves? Do we even dare ask the question? Feminist scholars in recent decades certainly do dare and state that the answer is often yes. But in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, when I was a student, the dominant approach to literary analysis was new criticism. Very old criticism from your perspective, right? We were to give texts a close reading and examine them without relating them to the author's biography or the sociological context in which they were created. A comment like this one, current one, about Laforet in the online Encyclopedia Britannica would have been ridiculed. The lives of the heroines in her novels strongly reflect the author's personal experiences. When I asked Elena Quiroga in 1975 if Tristura and Escribo tu Nombre could be called autobiographical novels, the novelist responded that her character, named Tadea, tiene mucha vivencia mía, aunque no sé exactamente mi vida. Elena and Tadea share life experiences, although the fictional life story is not exactly the same as the author's. Let me observe that my primary source of biographical information on Quiroga was my series of personal interviews with her. Except for some passing references in newspaper clippings, when I began my research, there really existed nothing about the life of Elena Quiroga. Nothing like Freixas' Adolescencia in Barcelona, and no overtly fictional autobiography with a character with the same name, like El Cuarto de Atrás. Both Tristura and Escribo tu Nombre were awarded major prizes in Spain, and Quiroga herself in 1983 was elected to membership in the Royal Spanish Academy. Joining the poet Carmen Conde, she became the second woman in the Academy. Quiroga then and now has often been bypassed by critics and readers, but her favorite novel, Tristura, which means sadness, I don't think I told you that, as well as the sequel, was not given a negative label for being fictional autobiography. The receipt of the National Critics Prize is ample evidence of high regard for the first of these novels. Quiroga also used her own life, particularly her childhood, as the underpinning of her earliest novel, the immature and unduly melodramatic La Soledad Sonora. Much to Quiroga's relief, it quickly went out of print. She was not pleased that I managed to get a copy anyway, read it, and comment on it, however briefly, in the 1977 monograph I wrote about her works. Unlike Freixas and Martín Gaite, Quiroga was not trying to give us autobiographical references, but she inadvertently gave us an example with this first novel of the difference between an immature work and a brilliant one that followed. Tristura was her 11th narrative work, and it is a marvelous piece of writing, certainly if you compare it with her first effort. That's not untypical, is it? We do mature as we mature. In Tristura, she returned to the subject of her childhood in an amazing psychological revelation of the inner world of a lonely, motherless little girl who often has reason to feel unloved. Considered by critics in Spain to be Quiroga's best work, Tristura nevertheless has at times been labeled a simple novel, maybe because it's limited to 2 years in the life of an 8 or 9-year-old girl. In fact, the work is marked by stylistic and structural complexities that may leave readers as bewildered as the young protagonist. Intermingled with episodes in the fictive present at her maternal grandmother's house in Santander are flashbacks from her father's home in Galicia. Both strands are related through the child's consciousness. To appreciate what is happening, the reader has to enter the inner world because there is no implied adult narrator to give guidance. The use of definite articles in the line that opens not only the first chapter, but 15 others, the door to the garden opened from the kitchen, suggests that the reader should recognize the particular door, garden, and kitchen. Often the little girl repeats conversations that she does not understand. A mature reader needs to fill in missing information to uncover what motivates the characters who are speaking. There's a reference to a study I did on this novel in your handout. Writing in a period when social objective realism dominated in Spain, Quiroga wrote against the current, creating penetrating psychological stream of consciousness novels. Nevertheless, her point of departure was reality. If experiences were not her own, they were ones that she observed. She was the next youngest of 17 children, so she didn't have to go far to find something to write about. Certainly, she provides us with an insightful criticism of Spanish society. Tadea is sent away from her father's home in Galicia and her brothers so that she may receive a proper education for a girl at her grandmother's house in Santander. The grandmother, no doubt, loves her, but she's elderly and passive, and she lets the aunt and the cousins humiliate and mistreat the little girl. Although Escribo tu Nombre has a more accessible style and structure than Tristura, it also escaped the negative assessment of women's fictional autobiography. The longest of Quiroga's novels, 575 pages in the Austral edition, it recounts 6 years of Tadea's life in chronological order from 1930 to 36. Perhaps of most interest to us today is its detailed treatment of life at a convent boarding school for girls. A number of well-known male Spanish authors had dealt with the boarding school experience at religious schools, but this one of Quiroga's is no doubt the longest literary treatment of a convent boarding school for girls in Spain. At the same time, the novel reveals many of the causes of the Spanish Civil War and has that enormous interest for us as well. In her Tadea novels, Quiroga has effectively combined the two tendencies of feminine autobiographical fiction identified by Cipli Hauskaite. The young girl's story illuminates the social historical context of pre-Civil War Spain while revealing her own awakening and self-awareness. With respect to the former aspect, Quiroga provides a detailed picture of sex roles across social class in the 1930s. Her work might be seen as a fictional precursor to Martín Gaite's influential essay, Usos Amorosos de la Posguerra Española. Martínez Quiroga, by the way, points out that Martín Gaite's essay explained to young women what their mothers had gone through and made them understand them better. And in some ways, if you went back to, maybe your great-grandmother, you might find her experiences in the Quiroga novel. One of my own first studies of Martín Gaite, written prior to the publication of El Cuarto de Atrás, posited that her novels were more related to Spanish writers of the so-called generation of 1898 than to the French New Novel. The author thought about my idea and then said she agreed with me, noting that Unamuno had been a friend of her father's and had often visited her home during her childhood, and that she had read all of his works. A repeated theme of Unamuno's relates to the immortality that literary characters have above and beyond that of their authors. Creating a fictional character who bears the author's name, or for that matter, writing an autobiography, thus makes it possible for the writer to live on. Perhaps Martín Gaite had this strategy in mind when she put a character of her name in that 1978 novel. Martín Gaite in El Cuarto de Atrás accomplishes more than providing her own enduring self-portrait. She verbally recreates the back room of her childhood home and likewise gives us a lasting image of the apartment where she lived on the street Doctor Izquierdo in Madrid from 1953 until her death. Moreover, she gives a certain immortality to her daughter, Marta, 1956 to 85, who lived there with her mother. Isn't Marta the young woman called simply Hija, who comes home late and tenderly kisses her mother, who has fallen asleep, clothed, sitting in a chair? On the midpoint of the parallel to our proposed spectrum, I have placed a later novel by Martín Gaite, Lo raro es vivir. On the surface, this is a fictional autobiography written in first person and set in the late 20th century. Although structurally compared in a number of ways to El Cuarto de Atlas, clearly the protagonist is not the author herself. That fictional character has a name, Águeda Soler, is much younger than her creator, and has a different profession. I have no background in psychology, but I believe that someone who does could find that Martín Gaite's loss of her daughter a decade earlier underlies the work. In the normal course of life, we anticipate the parents will predecease their children, not the reverse. Martín Gaite lost an infant son before Marta was born. She grieved for her parents, both of whom died in 1978, but Marta's death was surely a much greater sorrow. Moreover, the daughter died of AIDS, contracted from sharing a needle, at a time when effective treatment for AIDS and HIV did not yet exist. During my annual trip to Spain that year, I was told about the daughter's death by a friend in Salamanca and found it strange that no one in Madrid had mentioned it to me. When I returned to Madrid and started asking my contacts in the literary world, wanting to be sure before I called Carmen to offer sympathy, no one had heard about it. That is, until I asked a group of gay friends, on the correct assumption that they would know a great deal about the emerging epidemic of AIDS. They confirmed the daughter's death and pointed out that Marta's surnames in any obituary notice would not have caught people's eyes. Sanchez, from her father, Rafael Sanchez Ferlosio, from whom her mother had been separated since 1970, and Martín, from her mother, Marta Sanchez Martín. That this particular novel, Lo raro es vivir, or at least its title, was significant in the trajectory of Martín Gaite's career is underscored by the name chosen for an exposition about her that was held in Madrid in May 2001, within a year of her death. Lo raro que es vivir, una exposición en torno a la figura de Martín Gaite. Carmen's sister collaborated in assembling an exhaustive exposition that showed the relationship between the author's literary creation and her life. I regret that I wasn't there to see it. The character Águeda in Lo raro es vivir is not Carmen, but perhaps she is an imaginary older version of the deceased daughter. Would the psychology term be projection? In the fictional world, it is Águeda's mother, an artist, who has recently died, and the daughter who seeks to learn more about her. The book cover tells us that Águeda has gone through a period of rock and roll and tempestuous love affairs and is now settling down. Of course, the real Marta died too young to go through that maturation process, or like Águeda, to find a life companion and await the birth of her own child. Águeda is an archivist at work on a doctoral dissertation about an 18th century historical figure that will remind us of Martín Gaite's own research as a historian. Also of interest is the marked physical resemblance between Águeda and her mother, a resemblance that could deceive her elderly grandfather so that he will not know that his daughter has died. I leave further analysis of Lo raro es vivir to any of you who find it a promising subject. I've introduced it today primarily to reinforce my discussion of Fernández Cubas's Mi Hermana Elba. When I taught Martín Gaite's 1996 novel, invariably I thought of how it relates to her life. Of course, my graduate students and other readers are not likely to juxtapose the real Marta's early death with the characters in the novel. In reading and translating Fernández Cuba's fantastic tale from 1980, I had no reason to relate it to her life until I discovered her autobiographical essays a quarter of a century later. My initial approach to Fernández Cuba's first two volumes of stories, Mi Hermana Elba and Los Altillos de Brumal, was a discussion of them as fantastic tales. My guide was Todorov, who points out that the fantastic implies an integration of the reader into the world of the characters. This integration is accomplished in part through first-person narration. The use of first person could be a link between the fantastic and autobiographical fiction, but the fantastic is permeated with doubt. Neither narrator nor reader understands why the strange events occur. The fantastic element in the story Mi Hermana Elba relates to mysterious hiding places in the convent boarding school where much of the action occurs. Little Elba, who is nonverbal, what we might now call a special needs child, perhaps autistic, is particularly adept at finding these places where she becomes invisible. Entering the special places is like going through a one-way looking glass. Elba's older sister, who is the adult narrator of the story, and her friend Fatima at first know and use the hiding places, thus gaining access to off-limits quarters where they can spy on the nuns and examine their belongings, as well as play tricks on the servants. Elba also locates magical passageways that allow her to transcend time and space. No explanation is ever provided for either the hiding places or Elba's paths. When the older girls accept their entry into womanhood, they lose their magic abilities. From Cosas que ya no existen, we learn that Fernández Cubas attended a convent school, but as a day student, not a boarder. However, the episode of unjust punishment she received at the hands of a tyrannical nun, recounted in the chapter Segundo Bachillerato, perhaps provides a motivation for the author's subversive approach in the early tale. Based on their personal experiences, neither Quiroga nor Fernández Cubas conveys enthusiasm for studying with the nuns. What I found even more illuminating in Fernández Cubas' autobiographical volume were the chapters related to the death at age 28 of her oldest sister, Ana Maria, when Cristina was 16. She writes that not only did she never convert her deceased sister into a fictional character, but that she had suppressed memories of her as if she had never existed. As a reader, I thought the painful loss of the sister underpinned some of Fernández Cubas' stories, most notably Mi Hermana Elba. When I shared this thought with the author, she disagreed. No resemblance between fiction and reality, she said. And perhaps you, today, will be more receptive to my point of view? In the story Mi Hermana Elba, the girls' parents are having marital problems and send their daughters off to boarding school for that reason. The first year, the narrator is protective of little Elba and admires the child's mysterious abilities. The second year, they are sent to separate schools, and the older girl ignores Elba's magical efforts to communicate with her across distance. As the teenage narrator leaves childhood behind and becomes interested in boys, the magic hiding places cease to be of interest and no longer function for her. Moreover, she is ashamed of her little sister and rejects her. The parents have a reconciliation, the family is reunited, but the little girl has a tragic accident, falling to her death. The narrator's chief memory of Elba's funeral is the kiss she receives from her first boyfriend. In her diary, she writes, "This was the happiest day of my life." Fernández Cubas' narrator character, like Paloma Diaz-Mas in her memoirs, remembers the past by looking at notebooks and pictures from years before, but some of her memories are repressed. The adult in Mi Hermana Elba no longer recalls either the moment or the reason that compelled her to disfigure her little sister's face in a photo, probably by poking a pencil through it. In my original analysis of this story, I conjectured that there is a psychological explanation underlying this and some other fantastic tales by Fernández Cubas, that she creates characters who reject their sexuality in order to remain in their childlike imaginary worlds. Since reading the author's autobiography, I'm adding another layer to my reading of Mi Hermana Elba, a projection of her buried feelings about the loss of her sister. Discovering that she has difficulty evoking the image of Ana Maria, she confesses that she had erased her, figuratively expelling her from their childhood home, or trying to. When I read that confession, I immediately thought of the fictional narrator who tried to keep little Elba from entering her thoughts when they were sent to separate schools, and later destroyed her picture. The author expresses guilt at having repressed memories of her sister, whose death from natural causes left their father so grieved that he imposed mourning on his other children, almost as extreme as that of Bernarda Alba in Garcia Lorca's play. The father's rigid treatment of his other children in response to his deep sorrow, for me, is a second link between the real author and her fictional character. Cristina is somewhat older than Elba's sister was, but shares that character's desire to have boyfriends, travel, get an education. She is not willing to dress in black for years, or even months. When her father laments once again that he has lost a daughter, she daringly responds, "One daughter died, but you have 4 more." Her comment is the catalyst for his coming back from his grief and allowing his other children to live their lives. The chapter in the autobiography where the house is again open to the outside world is fittingly called Bernarda Alba abre el portón. Fernández Cubas would not say that her sister's funeral was the happiest day of her life, but fully aware of how a teenager feels, she indicates that happy days lay ahead. I hope that I have not presented an introduction to fictional autobiography or whatever that confuses more than it explains. I also hope that my thoughts, however rambling, may serve as a catalyst for some of you to undertake your own exploration of the topic and open doors to new perspectives on contemporary Spanish women writers. Thank you.
Any questions? In English or in Spanish, I guess.
Ou en français, si on veut. Pourquoi pas?
Bueno. Una pregunta. Yo tenía un comentario. A veces uno se pregunta, ¿qué importa? ¿Qué importa si es ficción, si es autobiografía? ¿Importa verdaderamente, bueno, aparte de que uno no puede conseguir un premio literario, quizás por eso, y también de la cuestión legal? Ha habido un par de juicios, de hecho, sobre una novela de Jorge Semprún, una novela autobiográfica. Él ganó el juicio porque al parecer alguien se sentía muy insultado, y Jorge Semprún ganó el juicio porque pudo confirmar que era una ficción, no era una autobiografía. O sea que la definición es importante desde un punto de vista legal y también para ganar premios, pero creo que también desde un punto de vista literario un libro se lee de forma muy distinta si se conoce la vida del autor. Porque es un juego, es un juego intertextual y que si no se conoce la vida uno pierde mucho. O sea, es importante saber qué hay detrás, qué elemento autobiográfico hay para de verdad poder ver todas las ironías de la novela o poder apreciar el sentido total de la novela. O sea que sí que importa.
No te hubiera gustado New Criticism, ni mucho menos.
No, importa.
¿Aquí hay estudiantes de Women's Studies?
No he visto a nadie por eso, por lo que
No,
me
bueno, me dijeron que iban a estar, porque la lucha contra New Criticism empezó con Women's Studies y con las minorías. ¿Cómo podemos hablar de la literatura de un cubano exiliado sin hablar de la experiencia del autor y decir no? Explicación de texto, seulement explicación de texto. Bueno, no estoy echando la culpa a los franceses. Era un movimiento New Criticism muy norteamericano.
Bueno.
Speaking of the pre-concours, and I'm surprised also because Marguerite Duras received the pre-concours with Lamont in the 1980s, and that's, you know, I mean, I don't know where you place her on your scale.
I'm sorry, I missed the name.
Marguerite Duras.
Ah,
She received the prix Goncourt for Lamont, right? In 1984, 1985, something like this. And the author you were mentioning was denied, right?
oh, Manet was denied. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a story he told me. You do have to understand that you hear the stories from the authors perhaps in a different fashion than you might hear it from the critics. At that time, Emmanuel Robles was still alive, and I could have asked him, but I didn't. You know, I just left the anecdote the way I'd heard it from Eduardo.
I guess I missed that part.
Yeah.
By which
Yeah, you know, no, as we say in Spanish, no pongo la mano en el fuego sobre esta anécdota. But thank you. Mil gracias. But I mean, it's quite possible that the story was true. Yeah.
In any case, it is very hard for a jury to judge based on the genre, because what would they do with El Cuarto de Atrás? Those who are in my course, we are going to read El Cuarto de Atrás, and as she mentioned, is a novel that is a very hybrid. It has, it is very, very autobiographical, to the point of narrator is, well, you mentioned that already, is her name is starts with a C, and that she's a writer, and she has a daughter who visits all these, the place, all she remembers about Salamanca, the place where she was born and lived. Not only that, it's autobiographical, but it's also a novela rosa. It parodies the novela rosa story, as you mentioned, and is very metafictional too. It's a self-begetting novel. So, what genre is that? What does the jury do with a novel that is so hybrid? They just cannot judge. I don't think they could, they should dismiss a novel on the ground that it is autobiographical. It doesn't make any sense to me.
In Martín Gaite's case, they gave her the Premio Nacional de la Crítica, so they were not upset about that. But that was Spain rather than Manet's experience in France. You know, he's won other prizes, and at the moment he is the I didn't get to say this at the conference at the University of Miami. Manet, un cubano, is the president of the Consejo de Escritores, estoy traduciendo al español, de la Sociedad General de Autores y Compositores en Francia. So this is an 82-year-old Cuban who is the president of the Authors Guild, if I translate it that way. That's not bad in terms of getting somewhere as an exile.
Well, no more comments or questions, so we invite you to have a snack And then those who are in my class, we meet in the classroom in about 15 minutes. Thank you for coming.